There comes a moment that feels almost unreal when everything just stops. No messages lighting up your phone, no missed calls, no sudden reappearances, just silence. The kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels heavy, it feels loud, it feels like something is about to happen, but nothing does. And that's what makes it so unsettling, because you're not the only one who stopped. They stopped too, and now you're both standing in this invisible space, waiting, wondering, thinking, who is going to break first? Or is this really the end? At first your mind tries to make sense of it. Maybe they've moved on, maybe they don't care anymore, maybe you meant nothing. But deep down, something doesn't sit right, because this silence feels different. It doesn't feel like closure. It feels like a pause in the middle of something unfinished, like a story that hasn't reached its ending yet. And that's where the confusion begins to grow, because when both of you stop contacting each other, it creates a kind of tension that most people aren't prepared for. It's not just absence, it's a psychological shift that starts changing everything beneath the surface. You start replaying every moment in your head, every conversation, every sign you might have missed. And the more you think about it, the louder the silence becomes. You check your phone, even when you know there's nothing there. You wonder if they're thinking about you too. You wonder if they're waiting, just like you are. And this is where the emotional weight starts to build, because when silence is mutual, it doesn't bring immediate relief. It creates a space where both people are forced to face what's really going on inside them. But here's what most people don't realize. When they stop reaching out, it's not always because they're done. It's not always because they've forgotten. In fact, sometimes it means the opposite. It means something deeper has been triggered, something tied to control, to ego, to the need to feel like they still have power over the situation. When they don't contact you, it can be a move, a quiet one, but a powerful one, because they're not just disappearing. They're watching what you do next. And at the same time, something is shifting inside you too. You may not notice it right away, but the moment you don't reach out, something changes. You're no longer feeding the dynamic that once kept everything alive. You're no longer chasing, explaining, or trying to fix what felt broken. And even if it doesn't feel like strength, even if it feels like pain, it is the beginning of a shift in power. This is why this kind of silence feels so different, because it's not one-sided. It's not someone ignoring the other while the other keeps trying. It's two people stepping back at the same time, whether intentionally or not, and that creates something unpredictable, something emotionally intense, because now there's no distraction, no constant interaction to mask what's really going on, just raw thoughts, raw emotions, and the truth slowly rising to the surface. Inside them, things aren't as calm as they might appear. Even if they're not reaching out, it doesn't mean they're at peace. Because when someone is used to having control, to knowing they can come and go as they please, this kind of silence disrupts that pattern. It creates uncertainty, and uncertainty is something they don't handle well. They start to wonder why you haven't reached out. They start to question what changed, and even if they don't show it, even if they act unaffected on the outside, there is a part of them that feels the shift, because in their mind, you were supposed to come back. You were supposed to break first. That's how it always worked before. That's the pattern they relied on. The belief that no matter what happened, you would eventually reach out, try again, reopen the door. And now, that door is still closed, not slammed shut, just untouched. And that's what starts to disturb them. Not the silence itself, but what the silence represents. A loss of control, a break in the pattern they thought they understood. And while they're sitting in that space, trying to make sense of it in their own way, you're going through something just as intense, but in a completely different direction. Because for you, this silence doesn't just bring questions about them, it brings questions about yourself, about what you felt, about what you tolerated, about why it's so hard to let go, even when nothing is happening anymore. You might feel a pull to reach out, a strong one, like something inside you is urging you to break the silence, just to feel something again, even if it's temporary, even if it leads back to the same cycle. Because silence can feel unbearable when you're used to emotional intensity. It can feel like something is missing, like a part of your reality has been taken away, and that's where the real challenge begins, not in what they're doing, but in what you choose to do next. Because this moment, this exact moment where both of you have stopped, is where everything starts to change, even if it doesn't look like it on the outside, even if nothing dramatic is happening yet. This is where the hidden psychological dynamic begins to unfold, where silence turns into something more than just absence. It becomes a test, a mirror, a shift in energy that starts to reveal the truth behind everything that happened before. They may not reach out right away. In fact, they might wait, watching, observing, trying to see if you break first, because in their mind, that would confirm everything they believed about you, that you're still emotionally attached, that you're still available, that nothing has really changed, and that's why they hold back. Not because they don't feel anything, but because they're waiting to see what you do with the silence. And as time passes, something unexpected begins to happen. The longer you stay silent, the more the dynamic starts to shift in ways neither of you anticipated. What once felt like power in their hands slowly starts to slip, and what once felt like weakness in yours slowly begins to transform into something else, something quieter but stronger, something they didn't expect, and something you may not even recognize yet. Because this silence, this space where nothing is being said, is actually saying everything. It's revealing who is dependent on the connection and who is learning to live without it. It's exposing patterns, breaking illusions, and forcing both sides to confront a reality that can no longer be avoided. And what happens next is where everything becomes clear. Because as the silence stretches on, something begins to shift in a way that is almost invisible at first, but deeply powerful underneath. They are still waiting, not in the way you might imagine, not with obvious signs or dramatic gestures, but quietly, calculating, observing, holding on to the belief that you will eventually give in. Because in their world, silence is not an ending, it's a strategy, it's a test of endurance, a way to see how long you can last without reaching back into the connection that once defined you. This is where the hidden psychological game truly begins. There are no rules spoken out loud, no clear signals, no direct communication, but everything is being communicated at the same time. Every day that passes without a message becomes a statement. Every moment you choose not to reach out becomes a move on a board you didn't even realize you were playing on. And in this game, the one who reacts first often loses the ground they didn't even know they had gained. They start to check, not always directly, but in subtle ways. A glance at your social presence, a curiosity about what you're doing, who you're with, whether you're moving on or staying stuck. Because even though they are silent, their attention hasn't disappeared. It has just shifted into the background, watching for signs, waiting for proof that they still matter in your world. But here's what's happening inside them that they would never openly admit. That confidence they once had, the certainty that you would return, begins to crack, slowly at first, almost unnoticeable. But with every day you remain silent, the questions grow louder in their mind. Why haven't you reached out? What changed this time? Is this silence different, or is it final? And that's where discomfort begins to replace control. Because control only works when the pattern stays predictable, when they know how you'll respond, when they can anticipate your emotions, when they feel certain about their position in your life. But now, that predictability is gone, and in its place is uncertainty. And uncertainty is something they struggle with more than anything else. It creates a kind of internal tension that they can't easily resolve, because they don't know if they're still in control or if they've already lost it. And while this is happening inside them, something equally intense is unfolding within you, but it feels completely different. For you, this silence isn't just about them anymore. It starts to turn inward. It starts to reflect back everything you've been avoiding, everything you've been feeling beneath the surface. The emotional withdrawal begins to take hold, not just from them, but from the version of yourself that was tied to them. There are moments where it feels overwhelming, where the urge to reach out becomes almost unbearable, where your mind tries to convince you that just one message, one small interaction, could bring relief. because silence, especially after emotional intensity, can feel like emptiness, and emptiness can feel like loss. But what you're actually experiencing isn't just loss, it's detachment beginning to form. And detachment doesn't feel strong at first, it feels confusing, it feels painful, it feels like something is being pulled away from you before you're ready to let go. But beneath that discomfort, something is changing. The emotional dependency that once kept you tied to the cycle is slowly weakening, not because you forced it, but because the silence is creating space for it to dissolve. You begin to notice small shifts, moments where you don't check your phone as often, moments where your thoughts about them aren't as consuming as they used to be, moments where you start to question not why they haven't reached out, but why you felt so attached in the first place. And those moments, as subtle as they seem, are powerful, because they mark the beginning of something they never expected. Because in their mind, silence was supposed to pull you back in. It was supposed to create longing, confusion, a desire to reconnect, and for a while it might have. But what they didn't anticipate was that the same silence could also push you forward, that it could create distance, not just physically, but emotionally, that it could give you the space to start seeing things clearly. And that's when the shift becomes undeniable, because at some point they begin to realize something is different, not just in the fact that you haven't reached out, but in the feeling behind it. There's a difference between someone who is silent but emotionally attached and someone who is silent and starting to let go. And they can feel that difference even without words, even without direct contact. And that realization, that moment where they start to sense that you're not coming back the same way you did before, is where everything changes for them. Confusion turns into discomfort. Discomfort turns into restlessness. And restlessness begins to chip away at the control they thought they still had. Because now the silence is no longer working in their favor. It's no longer pulling you closer. It's creating distance. Real distance, the kind they can't easily reverse with a single message or a sudden return, and that's when the dynamic starts to flip in a way that is both subtle and shocking. Because without realizing it, you've stepped into a position you were never in before. You're no longer reacting, you're no longer chasing, you're no longer feeding the cycle, and that changes everything. They start to feel it more intensely now. That absence you once felt begins to echo back toward them. The same silence that once made you question your worth now makes them question their importance in your life. And even if they don't show it, even if they try to distract themselves or appear unaffected, something deeper is shifting inside them, because for the first time, they are not in control of how this ends, and that is something they are not prepared for. They may try to ignore it at first, to convince themselves that it doesn't matter, that they can move on, find something new, replace what was lost. And sometimes they do try. They look for distractions, for new attention, for something that fills the gap left by your absence. But what they don't realize is that not all connections are easily replaced. Not all dynamics can be recreated, because what they had with you was built on a specific pattern, a specific emotional exchange, a certain level of access and control. And now that pattern has been broken, and no matter what they do on the outside, that break is still there. And as time continues to pass, the silence becomes heavier, not for you, but for them, because you are slowly adapting to it, and they are slowly being consumed by it. And that is the moment where the power shift becomes undeniable, because what once felt like emptiness on your side now begins to feel like pressure on theirs, a quiet, creeping pressure that builds with every passing day you remain distant, unmoved, and unreachable. And even if they try to ignore it, even if they distract themselves with noise, attention, or new faces, there is something about your silence that lingers in the background, something unresolved, something they can't quite replace. This is where things begin to unfold behind the scenes in ways you may never fully see, but you can feel. Because while you are slowly reclaiming your energy, they are slowly trying to figure out where it went. They begin checking more often than they admit, wondering more than they expected, not necessarily because they miss you in the way you might imagine, but because they feel the absence of your attention. And for them, attention was everything. They might scroll quietly, searching for clues, looking for signs that you've moved on, or signs that you're still affected. They may ask about you indirectly, pretending it's casual, pretending it doesn't matter, but it does, because your silence has created a gap in their reality. A space where they once felt certain, now filled with questions they can't answer. And as much as they try to appear unaffected, something deeper begins to fracture inside them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but subtly, like something slowly collapsing beneath the surface. Because when control fades, when validation disappears, when the predictable response they relied on is no longer there, it creates a kind of internal instability they are not used to facing. This is what you don't see, the internal collapse they will never openly show. From the outside, it may look like they've moved on effortlessly. It may look like they're fine, like your absence meant nothing, like they've replaced you without hesitation. But appearances can be deceiving, because what they project outwardly is often the exact opposite of what they feel internally. Inside, there is tension, frustration, a quiet panic that grows stronger the longer you remain out of reach. Your silence has done something they didn't expect. It has removed their access, and without access, they can't control the narrative anymore. They can't predict your next move. They can't rely on your emotional responses to stabilize their sense of importance. That loss, even if they never admit it, affects them deeply. Time begins to work against them in a way that is almost poetic. Because in this kind of dynamic, time weakens the hold they once had over you, while simultaneously increasing the discomfort they feel without you. The longer you stay silent, the more space you create between who you were and who you're becoming, and the more that space grows, the harder it becomes for them to reach you in the same way again. But for them, time doesn't create clarity. It creates craving, not necessarily for you as a person, but for what you represented, the attention, the connection, the control, the emotional response, all the things that once came easily and are now completely out of their reach. And the longer they go without it, the more intense that craving becomes. They are not used to absence. They are used to access. And now access is gone, so they begin to stand at a crossroads, whether they consciously realize it or not. Two paths start to form in front of them, both driven by the same underlying need to regain a sense of control. The first path is the return. This is where they consider reaching out again, sending a message that seems casual, maybe even indifferent, acting as if nothing happened, as if the silence meant nothing. But beneath that surface, the intention is clear: to re-establish contact, to reopen the door, to see if you are still available in the way you once were. But this return is rarely about closure. It's about testing whether the dynamic can be restored, testing whether they still have influence over you, testing whether your silence was temporary or if it has truly changed you. The second path is replacement. This is where they try to fill the gap with someone else. Someone new, someone who can provide the attention, the validation, the responsiveness they have lost. On the surface, it may seem like they've moved on completely. It may seem like you've been forgotten, like the connection meant nothing. But the truth that often goes unseen is that replacement is not resolution. It's distraction. Because no matter how quickly they shift their attention elsewhere, the pattern remains the same. The underlying need remains the same. And the absence of what they had with you, especially if it was intense, especially if it was emotionally charged, doesn't just disappear. It lingers quietly in the background. And sometimes, even while they are trying to replace you, they are still thinking about you, still wondering, still comparing, still feeling the difference between what they had and what they have now. And that's where the real tension builds, because no matter which path they lean toward, return or replacement, there is something they cannot escape. The fact that you did not break the silence, the fact that you did not chase, the fact that you stepped back and stayed back, and that is what unsettles them the most. Because in their experience, silence was always temporary, distance was always reversible, and you were always reachable. But now, you're not. And that realization, that shift from certainty to uncertainty, from control to loss, is something they never prepared for. And it leads to a moment that feels almost sudden, almost unexpected, even though it has been building this entire time. A moment where the silence finally breaks, but not in the way it used to, not with the same energy, not with the same power dynamic, because when they finally reach out, everything has already changed. It doesn't come the way it used to. It doesn't carry the same weight, the same pull, the same emotional grip it once had over you. It might look familiar on the surface, a simple message, a casual check-in, something that almost feels like nothing happened at all. But underneath that message is everything that has been building during the silence, the questions, the discomfort, the need to know if they still have a place in your world. And when you see it, when their name appears again after all that time, something inside you reacts, not in the same way it used to, but it still moves something, a memory, a feeling, a moment where the past and the present collide. And for a second, you might feel that old pull, that urge to respond the way you always did, to reopen the door, to step back into what feels familiar, even if it once hurt you. But this time, there's a pause, a real pause, because you're not the same person who once responded instantly. You're not the same version of yourself who felt like you had to keep the connection alive at any cost. Something inside you has shifted, even if you can't fully explain it. And in that pause, in that space between receiving their message and deciding what to do, lies everything you've gained during the silence. Because now you can see it, not just them, but the dynamic. You can feel the difference between what was real and what was reactive. You can sense the pattern that once kept you stuck. And for the first time, you're not automatically pulled back into it. You're aware, you're present, you're choosing instead of reacting. And that's what they didn't expect. They expected the same version of you, the one who would feel relief just hearing from them, the one who would respond quickly, emotionally, openly, the one who would unknowingly step right back into the cycle. But instead, they're met with something unfamiliar. Distance, calm, control. And that changes everything, because now the dynamic they once understood no longer exists. The emotional leverage they once had isn't there anymore, and they can feel it, even if you say very little, even if your response is neutral, even if you choose not to engage at all. They can sense the shift, and that shift creates something they are not comfortable with: uncertainty. Because now they don't know where they stand with you. They don't know if they can pull you back in. They don't know if the connection they once relied on is still available to them. And for someone who once felt in control, that uncertainty is deeply unsettling. But here's where the truth becomes even clearer. Sometimes they don't reach out at all. Sometimes the silence stays unbroken, and that can feel even more confusing, even more painful, because a part of you might still expect that moment, that message, that return that proves everything you felt wasn't one-sided. And when it doesn't come, it can feel like a different kind of ending. But even in that absence, there is meaning, because their silence is not always peace, it's not always closure. Sometimes it's avoidance, sometimes it's ego protection, sometimes it's the inability to face what they've lost control over. Because reaching out would mean acknowledging the shift. It would mean risking rejection. It would mean stepping into a space where they are no longer guaranteed the response they once depended on. And for them, that risk can feel too great, so they stay silent, not because you didn't matter, but because the dynamic changed in a way they couldn't control. And that's something they don't know how to navigate. But while they remain in that space, something entirely different is happening within you. This silence, the one that once felt heavy, confusing, almost unbearable, begins to transform. It starts to feel lighter, clearer, more peaceful. Not because you've forgotten, but because you've understood. You begin to see that what you were holding on to wasn't just the person, it was the pattern, the emotional intensity, the highs and lows that kept you attached. And without that constant cycle, your mind begins to settle, your emotions begin to stabilize, and your sense of self begins to return. And that's the part no one talks about enough. the healing that happens in the silence, the way you slowly reconnect with yourself, the way your worth stops being tied to someone else's attention, the way you begin to feel whole again without needing validation from the very place that once made you question everything. And in that process, something powerful happens. You stop waiting, not because you forced yourself to, but because you no longer feel the need to. And that is the real shift. Because the moment you stop waiting is the moment you take your power back completely. And it doesn't come with a dramatic realization. It comes quietly, in the way you no longer check your phone the same way, in the way their name doesn't carry the same emotional weight, in the way your thoughts about them become less frequent, less intense, less consuming, and eventually they become just that, thoughts, not attachments, not triggers, not something that controls your emotional state, just something that once was. And that transformation is something they never expected, because in their mind you would always be connected to them in some way, always accessible, always affected, always within reach. But now you're not just physically distant, you're emotionally unavailable to the pattern itself. And that is what truly shocks them. Not your silence, not your absence, but your transformation, because it represents something they cannot easily reverse, something they cannot control, something that no message, no return, no sudden reappearance can fully undo. And that's when the truth becomes undeniable. The silence between you was never empty. It was revealing everything. It showed who was dependent. It showed who was growing. It showed where the power truly lies when emotional patterns are broken. And in the end, the outcome was never about who reached out first. It was about who healed, who faced themselves, who used the silence as a space to become stronger instead of weaker. And if you've made it to this point, if you've stayed in that silence long enough to feel the shift within you, then you already know the answer. The real win was never getting them back. The real win was getting yourself back.